So thank you. Welcome to our second workshop for the City of Chino's housing element. As you may or may not know, this is the workshop where we're going to go over the city's public review draft, which was released last Friday. So it's posted on the city's website, and we'll be up there for approximately 30 days. We'll be there till August 8th. So we'll go over all that during the presentation. You have myself. My name is Nick Chen with Kimley Horn. I think I've seen a number of you and spoken to a number of you at past council workshops or steering committee sessions or a number of different meetings. So it's good to see you again. We also have Warren Morellian here with city staff, I'm sure you all know well. And then Bryant De La Torre, who's here with Kimley Horn as well. Brian is actually a native Spanish speaker, so if anybody has questions in Spanish or would like to get more information, he's happy to provide that information as well. So with that, we'll jump into the presentation. And we'll test I'm going to switch over to there. So tonight's going to be a quick runaround of everything we've done for the housing element so far. So we'll go through a recap of what the housing element process is, where you can find more information that's still available. We'll go through the city's community engagement efforts to date. We'll go through the public review draft, primarily focused on sites and the housing policies. All the sections are important. Those are the two kind of major sections, especially when it comes to discussion. But as I said, all the different sections are important, and we'll go through the different components of the housing element. We'll talk about community review and feedback. There are at least 4 different ways to be able to give feedback on the public draft housing element. So we've expanded it from the typical just email city staff. We do have that option as well, but vastly expanded that. We'll also go through next steps, kind of the timeline that I talked about earlier. And lastly, we'll do a question and answer. So first couple slides will be just an overall recap of the housing element update process. If you want more information on this, we did do a very expanded PowerPoint presentation for the community workshop number 1. And we went through that, and it's still available on the city's website. Actually, it was virtually recorded. It goes into a lot more information on the different components of the housing element and why it's so important to have a certified housing element and have an adopted housing element. But a couple of the key points. It demonstrates Chino's ability to meet their housing needs. It allows the community to engage in the process. It also allows the city to remain qualified for a number of state grants, different funding sources. Some of these are tied directly to housing element certification. So it's important to make sure that the city ultimately gets an adopted and then certified housing element as well. And then lastly, just to ensure the city complies with all state housing laws. There's a number of new housing laws that have come out since around 2018 is when they really started to come out in force. And there's been a number since then every year that have come across. I keep hitting the wrong button. So a little bit of overview of the different features. There's a population and housing profile. This is the baseline for the housing element. It goes through a number of different census data points, different data sources that talk about the housing profile. It really allows the community to key in on what's important with the community relating to housing. So it could be economic characteristics, could be population and household characteristics. There's a number of different tables in there, probably 30 or so with different data sets. All relating to Chino and doing some comparison to surrounding jurisdictions, surrounding cities and counties. There's an evaluation of housing constraints and resources. This is big because it identifies potential government, non-governmental, environmental, and other constraints that may inhibit the development of housing. When we talk about development of housing specifically, we're talking about the next 8 years, 2021 to 2029. That's the 6th cycle housing element, and it's the current housing element cycle that we're planning for. We also look at resources, primarily land resources, but also other potential strategies the city can use to try and eliminate some of those or mitigate some of those constraints to housing development. We go through an evaluation of the existing housing element. So the city's current housing element is the 5th cycle housing element. It ran from 2013 to 2021, and as of October 15th, that will be the end date for the 5th cycle, and when we'll move to the 6th cycle. We look at what was done well, what potentially needs to be carried on to the 6th cycle in terms of being able to either expand on it, or if it was just working well and is an ongoing program the city wants to continue, oftentimes it does go on to the next cycle. We also look at the city's site strategy. We'll go into this in more detail later. I know we've covered it at a couple past council study sessions, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on some of the feedback that City Council provided as well. And lastly, the policy program. This is really the action plan for the city. These are the policies and programs and actions the city will take over the next 8 years related to housing, and really related to all different types of housing. And we'll walk through what the city's 5 main goals are and then how to read through one of the programs as well. So to date, a little bit of an overview. The city began the process in 2019, spring of 2019. There was a summer 2020 workshop presentation. That's what I referenced earlier, being available on the city's website. I think you'll see the cover photo is a picture of the mayor who gave a great intro to that workshop, and then a kind of detailed presentation about how the housing element works and how that process works. There was a community survey. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that. I believe over 200 individual respondents participated in that, which was extremely helpful. We also had a steering committee that met monthly, with the exception of a few months here and there, and we'll go over their participation as well. And then sort of up to date, last Friday, the public review draft of the housing element was made available. I'll say it a couple times. It's available on the city's website for comment until August 8th. And even that is just when we eventually take comment. But it's still at that point a draft document. It goes to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. So there's public comment all through, basically until it gets adopted. And then all of that information, as I mentioned, will be available or is currently available on the city's housing element update website. So I mentioned the recording of the first workshop. Straightforward. If you want more information on the workshop or just on the background on housing elements in general, you can go take a look at that presentation. It's still available. The Housing Community Survey. This was really important. It allows us to focus in a little bit on programs, some general site types. It wasn't necessarily location-based on what types or what areas of the city or what sites should be focused on specific to different parcels, but it was a look at different types of housing the city could potentially look at addressing in the housing element. Over 2,600 individual data points and 142 comments that we worked through to be able to incorporate some of that feedback into the document. As I mentioned, we had a steering committee. I believe it was 11 members, I think was the number. And we met monthly, as you can see, January, February, March. There was a short hiatus as we worked through some of the sites discussion with City Council. We kept that group up to date, and then we did meet again in June, and we'll actually meet on Thursday as well. That group does meet virtually, and we walk through different parts of the housing element document. Some of the main kind of priorities of the steering committee were to provide feedback. Oftentimes they saw the versions of the document to be able to give feedback. Again, everything was in draft form and still is in draft form, but they were able to give initial feedback, initial comments on the site strategy. We walked through different housing programs and what the housing goals should be in the community. And again, this was just to have a representative group of the community to be able to give feedback and be a first look. Obviously, they're not the end-all, be-all. It was just advice up front. Council gave their advice as well, and now the community as a whole, as they have been able to do throughout the process, can give advice as well on the housing element process. So, as I mentioned, we walked through these different components. Another priority was to be an advocate for the housing element. So, to get the word out, to help people understand what the city is doing as part of the housing element update process. Obviously, that is something that our team is doing as well, city staff, but we can always use a couple helping hands in the community to help us with that as well. So they worked through that and ended up being a great group and a lot of great feedback that we got on the housing element update process. Oh, there we go. So we'll go into the draft housing element document a little bit. As I mentioned, every individual section is posted on the city's website. There are 4 main sections: introduction, the community profile, which I mentioned is the demographics portion of the housing element, constraints, resources, and fair housing, which, as I mentioned earlier, looks at housing constraints and constraints to the development of housing, as well as different housing resources, and also does a lengthy fair housing analysis to look at an equitable distribution of housing throughout the community and resources for community members. We also looked in the 4th section at the housing plan. It's available online as well. And then 4 appendices, which are a review of the past 5th cycle housing element, the more detailed sites analysis strategy, community engagement overview. You can see all public comments submitted to date, and all the public comments we get for this draft document will be included in that version as well once it goes to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And then we'll also have a glossary of terms, common housing terms that may not be very common to everyone else. So acronyms and things that can be used throughout the document. So if there's ever a term that you don't quite understand, it's a good chance if you go to the Appendix D, that term is explained there, if it's not explained in the text right there. So the city sites identification process, we've gone through this. A couple different criteria we looked at. The city has to plan for housing at all 4 income levels. So there's a state-defined income levels of very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And these are based on percentages of the area median income for the county for 2021. So all that information is in the document. It's also in the past presentations we've shown in the table as you see in the presentation. But we looked at candidate housing sites and what would make a good candidate housing site. Obviously, vacant sites. Vacant sites is important because the state actually has an identification criteria that says if you are able to meet 50% of your lower need on vacant sites, that is an incentive to show that there's not something that's inhibiting development, or it may not be something that's inhibiting development. So it allows a different level of analysis to take place. The city was able to do that. If you look at the document, the table in Appendix B actually has each site that's currently vacant and marks those in the table. As you go through, we also look at underutilized parcels. We looked at potentially conversion of different commercial areas. And as many of you may know, based on past meetings, we ended up coming with 2 overlays that I'll explain in a little bit. So every site in the city, essentially, except for the majority of protected areas or areas that didn't have the potential to develop, was evaluated and either included or not included in the housing element update process. So the city's site strategy ultimately boiled down to 2 primarily, we'll call them 3 strategies, 2 primary strategies. There was a mixed-use overlay that was created. And I should focus again, maybe real quickly, on the housing program, because these haven't actually been created yet, and they won't be created with the adoption of the housing element. They will be created within 3 years as mandated by state law. By the city, they're implementing actions of the housing element. So adoption of the housing element doesn't just automatically create these and apply this overlay zone to the sites that are identified. That's a supplement. It's a program that takes place after the housing element's adopted. But as we went through, there was the mixed-use overlay, which went over existing commercial properties. This anticipated development. I think I'm getting ahead of myself again. This anticipated development of potential residential uses up to 30 dwelling units an acre over existing commercial areas. And these areas were looked at. They were discussed by the steering committee, city staff, our project team, city council. We've had a number of different looks at these different sites. And we will continue to as we go through the process. The community will take a look, and to the extent that any of this information, if anyone wants to comment on it, people are welcome to do that and submit those comments as we go through a little bit. The other was a housing overlay. This just assumed straight development to residential. It didn't assume any mix of commercial uses as part of that. But again, that was up to that 30 dwelling unit per acre, and also happened to coincide 30 dwelling units per acre with the state's default density for a city the size of Chino. So as we went through, as I mentioned, we went through this housing element process. We came to City Council and we said, here's a very initial draft list of sites. And City Council said, we would like to see some different analysis done to evaluate these sites. And so we said, sure. Well, what would you like to see happen as part of this? And they identified a rating criteria. That rating criteria was on a transportation corridor, primarily Ramona, Central, Chino Hills Parkway, Euclid, and then Grand and Edison, within half a mile of either 60 or 71 freeway. This was for ease of access in and out of the city. Size requirements. Assembly Bill 1397 identifies sites, essentially needs to hit what we call like a Goldilocks provision, which is either greater than half an acre or less than 10 acres. And it's because sites that are smaller than half an acre are difficult to redevelop for housing. They tend to be too small, or you need to couple together a couple of parcels. And with different ownerships, this can be tough. There actually are a few sites in the housing element that are smaller, but they again have been identified either as part of a grouping of sites or consolidation, I think they're called in the housing element. And it's because they share either property lines or they have common ownership across the parcels. Something that makes it realistic to say that they'll redevelop within the next 8 years. Walkability and bikeability, we looked at existing bike paths, existing sidewalks. Near parks and open space, all the green that you see on the map up here is actually within a quarter mile and a half mile. So dark green is quarter mile, and then after that is half mile of existing parks or open space. We took a look and identified all of those and saw what sites fell within that criteria. We also looked at adjacent uses. So if commercial was next to it, it was highest priority. If multifamily was already next to it, it got a 2 out of 3. And if single family was next to it, it got a 1. So lowest priority. And as I always feel inclined to mention, I feel like I need to mention, the housing element process doesn't mean the city's going to go ahead and as soon as that gets adopted, it's going to build all this housing. This is just creating the mechanism within the city to be able to develop this housing should the market determine that this housing should be built. So the city is not a developer. The city is not required to build this housing. The city is not going to go through and ultimately start developing these sites. So I feel like I need to mention that a couple times throughout every presentation. So as I mentioned, the mixed-use overlay, a little bit more detail on it. So it permits residential in conjunction with commercial uses. So typically when we think of mixed use, we think of 2 types of mixed use. First one's vertical, which is probably the more traditional, where you have residential or housing units on top of first floor commercial. You see them in downtown areas, whether it be just a couple floors or more than that. The second is horizontal mixed use. So you have residential uses and commercial on the same property right next to each other. And it may look just more like traditional housing and commercial development next to each other. But oftentimes if done in, say, a mall redevelopment or a shopping center redevelopment, can help to really revitalize commercial uses because it can provide more users that are right in near vicinity, walking distance away. So helps to cut down on car traffic as well. For this, because we assume that commercial uses might stay or there might be a larger commercial component, we essentially applied an 80% factor to the potential development yield of these sites to get a more realistic capacity of what might come on these sites. Ultimately, these sites are still available to be developed up to 30 dwelling units an acre, as the zoning says, but we wanted to make sure that we accommodated for potential other uses, given the kind of definition of that strategy. As I mentioned, HD's default density is 30 dwelling units an acre. That's why I keep harping on that number. That's the number essentially that the state has identified for the city of Chino to say affordable housing is likely or can be built at this level. It doesn't mean that units that are built at 30 units an acre are going to be affordable. You can build, if the agreement works out such affordable units that you can even build single-family affordable units. The city of Chino has some existing single-family affordable, or you can build 60 dwelling units an acre and none of it's affordable. So the housing element contains strategies to promote and incentivize the development of affordable housing. So that's how that strategy sort of works. And then the affordable housing overlay. This is essentially very similar. It just doesn't assume the addition of any mixed use or any commercial or non-residential uses. It assumes full development, and as such, in the analysis, we did a full assumption of what that development might be. Now, I should say, we like to take a slightly more conservative strategy, conservative approach. So all development was assumed within these 2 overlays at while it can accommodate up to 30 dwelling units an acre and someone developing can get up to 30 dwelling units an acre, it was assumed at 25, just taking into consideration some potential site constraints or somebody maybe not wanting to develop up to the full density. So we try and get as accurate as we can. Obviously, this is a planning practice. This is a document that looks over 8 years, and it cannot be hyper accurate, but we get as close as we possibly can. Other than that, a lot of the characteristics stay the same. The important thing to remember with these 2 overlays is that the base zoning, or what's there right now, stays the same. So this does not change anything on a parcel other than adding what we call an entitlement, or the ability for a property owner to do something else. If they do nothing, or if they develop per the base zoning, it is not a non-conforming use. It is not something that is not allowed or anything like that. They are developing per what they're allowed to do in the zoning. And the city essentially has accommodated as a buffer to accommodate if that case does happen where they don't develop for residential. So as we go through, probably have about, for anyone who's looking, about 10 more minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A in a little bit. So housing policy actions. This is the other important part of the housing element. Before we go into housing policy actions, I actually want to touch on 2 more things. Part of the site strategy was identified to be accommodated in specific plan areas as well. So the Preserve and Rancho Miramonte were a portion of the housing strategy. You'll see that in Appendix B, and you'll see an evaluation of those as well. We also had accessory dwelling units. Those are becoming more and more popular as we, in every city, not just Chino, more and more popular as an affordable housing strategy. The state has even worked with what's called the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, to develop affordability assumptions based on what we call ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. So the city's allowed to make an assumption of the number of ADUs. Every one of those is a new housing unit that wasn't there before. So it's allowed to be counted as the city as a dwelling unit. They can count towards meeting their regional housing needs allocation. So housing policy actions. As I mentioned before, probably the easiest way to explain this is it's the action plan for the city. It's the actions the city is going to take to essentially either do anything from look for funding sources for affordable housing. As I mentioned, the site strategy or creating the two overlays are different actions. We'll go through an action, I think it's 3A, that talks about the city taking actions to meet their regional housing needs allocation, essentially the need or number of units, the tracking that they have to do in terms of annual reporting. But we'll go through all of that. Some of the proposed 6-cycle programs were previous. So they were in the 5th cycle document, either in the very similar language or slightly modified. There's a number of programs in there that are new, either based on the analysis that was done in the community profile or constraints and fair housing sections, or new just based on a new requirement from state law. So there's some like ADU monitoring, for example. If the city's going to make an assumption on accessory dwelling units, they have to then monitor those and report back to make sure their assumptions were close to accurate. So that's a new requirement that you'll see as one of the programs in there. And then some are just, as I mentioned, based on the analysis, either in community profile or fair housing. That's important because the community profile tells us a lot about the community and what the needs are. So you'll see certain programs relating to that. And then fair housing is a big new section in terms of the fair housing analysis that looks at the equitable distribution of housing throughout the community. Looks at a number of opportunity areas and goes much more in detail. And if you have any questions, there's more information in the housing element, but we're also happy to answer questions if you have them. We'll also, so that's pretty much the housing policy actions. I did want to go through one of the actions after I go through the goals, just so you can see the different components that are required to be there. So the city has 5 major housing goals as part of those actions, and all of those actions fall into one of the 5 categories. And I don't like to read off PowerPoints, but I want to make sure I get these right. So the first goal is maintenance and improvement of existing housing stock. This is a lot of relating to either preservation or conservation of existing housing, especially existing what we might call, well, not deed-restricted affordable, existing affordable units that are either someone's had it for a long time, and that's really the only housing they can afford, or it's existing affordable housing within the community. The city wants to recognize that just because something's not what we call deed-restricted affordable, there's not an agreement that puts it as an affordable housing unit for a certain number of years, that they look at the older housing stock and the existing housing stock to make sure they evaluate that and do what they can to keep that as affordable. Housing goal 2 is adequate housing opportunities to meet the affordable housing needs of the community, including those groups with special housing needs. And we call special housing needs, it could be anywhere from senior to students. It could be large families. It could be any range of different different community groups relating to housing. So a little different than when we typically talk about special needs groups, but there's basically analysis for each of these different types of groups. Housing goal 3 is an adequate housing sites identification. This is essentially saying the city will meet its regional housing needs allocation. This is the number of units that's been essentially identified by the state and by the Southern California Association of Governments for Chino to be able to meet. It's the target goal for them. 4 is mitigation of governmental constraints. These are essentially, as the analysis points out, governmental constraints are potential constraints that the city can influence. So it may be processing times, it may be fees, it may be anything related to the review process. The city can do an annual review and take a look at these to see what they potentially can do that may or may not be inhibiting housing development as identified in the analysis in the housing element, as opposed to non-governmental constraints, which are land costs, building costs, things that the city doesn't have control over. And then lastly is the fair housing opportunity. And this takes a look at what could be done essentially in the community to, again, look at that fair and equitable distribution of housing. And what that is not, cut the community into square blocks and say there's going to be the same amount of housing in every group. Obviously, different areas have different characteristics, and that's why we did the sites analysis the way we did it. But it is looking to make sure that different groups within the community have access to resources that may be important, transportation, all these different factors that may lead to quality of life, may lead to important life factors for every community and every group within the city. So with that, I wanted to go through Program Action 3A and just talk a little bit about each of the, essentially using this as an example of what the programs look like in the document. So you'll see adequate sites. And if you read through this, it essentially says the city is going to maintain an inventory through the housing element of the number of sites that are identified and how many units they're anticipated to essentially accommodate once they get redeveloped. As those sites develop, whether they redevelop as the housing element shows or as something else, the city will monitor that and track progress as development happens outside of the sites that were identified, anywhere else in the city, which it certainly still can. The city will track that as well. And as I mentioned, ADU development will track all of that. So essentially that's what this program lays out. It lays out an objective and action that the city can look at and say, did we do this or did we not do this? They can say, did we create an inventory or did we not? And they, through their annual progress reports, are required to create that inventory. It also has a time frame. You'll see it says ongoing. Some of these will say within 1 year, the adoption of the housing unit. Some will say within 2 years. Some are required within 3. Ongoing means the city has to do it every year, essentially throughout. So it may also say annually, just depends on the language. It also identifies a responsible agency. In this case, it's the City of Chino Development Services Planning Division. That's the agency that's going to make sure this program gets carried out. A number of these fall in that category. And then when it talks about funding sources, these range. A lot of them say general fund because it's general staff duties, staff responsibilities. But there's also Section 8 housing. There's a number, housing choice vouchers, I should say. There's home funds. There's different identification of housing resources and resources, as well as programs to identify different funding sources. So those 4 components, an objective, a time frame, a responsible agency, and then lastly, a funding source or what's required to be identified for each objective. And you'll see that under each one. So we'll go through a little bit of community review and feedback, and then I promise I will stop talking. So one of the different ways, essentially, I talked about the community document, or the public review document being available until August 8th for public comment. That is a full month, full 30 days. Bless you. So one of the ways, probably the easiest way to provide feedback is on the city's website. There is a very simple survey, and essentially it has 4 questions in it. It says, do you have comments on Section 1? Please let us know. Comments on Section 2, 3, and 4. And there are free response areas, and it goes directly to us, and we can then compile all those comments together and include them in the document. We'll include them in Section C in the appendix, so all of that will be made available. And so that is the easiest way for you and for us to be able to track that information. But you can also come in and hand over a physical copy of comments to city staff at the counter. You can email either Warren, his email address is up there, or you can, we have a question and answer tonight. We also have written public comment cards that you can leave a comment on and drop them off with Bryant, and he'll be happy to take those from you. We'll consider all of those as well. We'll scan those, make sure they get in the document as well. So there's a number of different ways to provide comments. You also have, again, 30 days to be able to provide those comments. So don't worry about, not having enough time. Hopefully that 30 days is enough time. If not, it's still technically under public review as it goes to the state. And up until it gets adopted, everything is still a draft document that's available for comment. We just need to have a cutoff to point where we can then send a document to HCD. So next steps, we released the public review draft. Tonight is workshop number 2, 30 days for public review and feedback. After that, the feedback will be incorporated into the housing element document. And then ultimately, the document will go for review for by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. It's a requirement of every document that intends to be certified for any state or county within California. And then hopefully after that, local adoption by City Council. So that is essentially the rest of the work timeline that we have for this process. It seems like a lot, but it will go very quickly. I think go ahead and cut that. And with that, we have question and answer. So thank you so much for sticking with me. Appreciate it. I think in order to get the comments on the video and be able to capture it so we have a record of it, we will have to come up to the mic. So feel free. Again, it's a small group, whoever would like to go. So feel free, as we do in a normal meeting, come into the workshop. There is no time requirement. As we go through, we'll try and answer questions as best as possible, but some may be that we need to get back to you. In which case, just make sure on a comment card we have a way to comment or to contact you, and we'll be able to get back to you with any comments or feedback. So if we don't have the answer now, we'll definitely try and get it to you. So with that, thank you, and we'll do question and answer. Absolutely. Yes. We are at workshop number 2, yep. Nope, no problem. I'll leave that up. It's probably more informative than the one that just says Q&A. So whoever wants.
Good evening, I'm Pat Loy. I'm with Lewis Management Corp., and thank you for holding the workshop tonight. We did provide some comments, mainly their clarification of items in the draft report already to Warren, but I did have a question on that. I know next week there's a Planning Commission hearing and then a City Council hearing. What are those, what will be the outcome of those meetings, and where do they fit on the next steps in this chart?
That's a great question. Thank you. Pat is right. We do have on Monday a Planning Commission study session, and on Tuesday a City Council study session. Both are at 7 p.m., I believe. Both in the same room. And they will essentially be a review of this, a very similar presentation to this, a walkthrough of this process to go through with Planning Commission and City Council to get their comments specifically in a setting where they're able to provide it. So they obviously are able to provide it through any of the other methods as well, but those are public comment or public hearings where people are invited to come give comments as well, members of the community. There's not an action for that meeting. It is simply to inform the community, inform the commission, and inform the council about where we are in the process and the release of the document. So there will not be an adoption or anything like that, or even at this point, a recommendation that the document go to the state.
Okay, thank you. A quick follow-up. So if we put information in today, is there a need to come for Planning Commission or Council? You've already received that input, so that's for the Planning Commission and Council's benefit to get their feedback on the plan.
Correct. There won't be any different information than was shown tonight.
And we've somebody still has the 30 days, as you mentioned.
Absolutely, yep, until August 8th.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Does anyone want a comment card that didn't get one? No? The comment card?
I signed in, I don't know, do I need to fill one?
Only if you want one. Yeah. Would you like one?
I mean, if you don't want it to be recorded, then.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to clarify something and then ask 2 questions. Is it mandated by the state or federal government to have so many additional houses per city? I didn't know if you said it wasn't, like they for sure wouldn't be building on all these sites eventually, or that they have to build a certain amount for sure.
So that's a good question as well. The city is only required to plan for a certain amount of housing, essentially their regional housing needs allocation, or that number that's identified in the housing element. So as long as they plan and create the zoning to accommodate that, what happens in terms of actual development is really up to the market and what will get built. So the city does not need to essentially require that. In some cities, there's talk of like a carryover to the following cycle if you don't meet your need. At least historically, that's only been if you didn't complete one of your program actions
So the
related
plan
to
has
sites.
to be there, and not necessarily the building has to happen.
Correct, yeah. The city can't control ultimately what building actually happens. They can do different things, like I said, to identify different processes that maybe they can streamline to make it a little bit easier. But the city, yeah, as I mentioned, the city doesn't have any control over what actually gets built.
So I have two questions. The first is, I love living in Chino. I love it. I've lived here 18 years. I love the medians, the grants you guys get to keep things going. What I don't love is the amount of warehouses and commercial buildings, and I drive to church we go to church in Eastvale, and just every Sunday it's like new farms are gone, new this is gone. So the reason that people love living in Chino, the rural, the country feel, like it's just disappearing every week. It seems worse. Even by my house, there's a new fence up where there was empty land, and now it won't be empty land. So it's hard to live in a city where you thought you were living in a small city, and then now it's getting so big, and to see how many, it's nice to know that this is just being planned for and not automatically you're required to do it. So I guess it's kind of frustrating to see how much it's developing, and I know taxes, I know they need the money to keep everything going, but that's more of, I guess, of a comment. And then how much it's a little sad to see not so many people here, and I know that's frustrating for you guys too, to ask for comments and not have a lot of residents show up. How much does feedback matter? I mean, if I send my little email to the mayor, which I did a while ago, I like the rural city, don't build so much. I mean, it's not like she says, oh, Rhonda says no more warehouses, let's not do anything. How much does comments even play a part in what your master plan is eventually going to be?
So I'll say comments relating to the kind of content of the housing element document that come to us are all reviewed, are all considered. They all get put in the document. So they're all become part of the record of the document. And we really do review them and take a look. It's not, it doesn't happen super frequently, but they were part of the analysis, something, a number is wrong, we need to correct it, or just something else needs to be looked at. I can think of an example in a city I was just working in where someone wanted to see a particular focus on senior housing because they wanted to see a breakdown in the analysis between single seniors, male and female, and see the analysis there and what their housing needs were. So we added a little bit more based on that comment. So we can add that type of thing to the overall picture of will this stop housing development? I mean, it's a tough thing to say. Obviously, the city is going to develop as it probably would continue to. The housing element is just going to be one part of that kind of overall development pattern of what's ultimately going to happen. So if the comment is specific to the housing element.
Euclid, where you guys have it planned on Euclid, it's already getting so dense, and Euclid's getting so much traffic already. I mean, do you listen to hey, can you put Euclid low on your list because the density is just getting so much over there already with the warehouses, and the traffic has just picked up incredibly. So is that something you take into effect, or do you want to know just more numbers and data versus my opinion on don't build on Euclid?
No, we would like you to submit your opinion on don't build in certain areas, or this area is a great development area or has good potential. Obviously the folks who live in the community know it best. So if there's areas that through these different meetings, either with council or with steering committee or with staff, that we've missed, we want to make sure we can go back and evaluate. That's why we do the draft and why this isn't submitted to the state yet. So if you have different areas you want to point out, definitely point those out. It doesn't mean necessarily that there's going to be a change in the document, but at least it's something in the record. And if we see a bunch of comments in different areas, it could potentially be something that plays a factor. So yeah, please submit those.
I got a pretty easy question for you. I get the whole thing, what you're doing here, and the affordable low income, all that stuff there. What metric are you using to define what low pricing is compared to low moderate and everything else? And on top of that, with the price of land and construction, what period are you using to come up with a price range that is affordable? And is it going to rely on having subsidies for the city or the state to get to the low income? What you're giving us now is the matrix of the whole thing, but not the mix, because you're talking about low-income housing for seniors and so on. There's a mix between that. Low-income housing for seniors could be $400,000 compared to what they used to. What are you using? I mean, you can come up with this plan, but you're not showing the pricing of the plan or what the neighborhood's going to look like. To construct a house, basic house pretty much similar to even a high-end plywood footing and everything else. So what is going to make the price go down in today's market in the future in 2009 when you don't know where it's going to be at? How are you going to guide a developer that comes and says, I want low-income housing, but it's going to be $4,000 a month rent if he's using rentals? How are you going to control the value on a monthly or a semi-yearly evaluation of what really is low housing?
Yes, so there's a couple points in there. Probably the first and maybe the most straightforward is that the way that those get determined are based on a percentage of the overall county area median income. So it's actually broken down in the housing element. In section 3, there's a cost to development. So it goes through kind of sample development costs. It goes through all the development costs in the city. It goes through sample land costs, and it goes through that analysis. But to get more to your point, to get different development, like you talked about, incentives or use density bonus or different things, you have to deed restrict units at certain levels. And those are levels that are available at different income levels. So if you take the area median income for the county, you break it down into low and very low, which is 50% or lower of that area median income number. And then you cut that by 12 to get the monthly cost of what housing would be. You add in utilities, you add in different costs. It has to be available and affordable to a family or an individual or however many people are in there that can afford that income category. And they have to show proof of that income level to be able to qualify for these deed restricted units. So those are what we're talking about when we talk about affordable units, people only qualifying. And there are people who manage and run those as part of development. So a development will come in and say, we're going to do a certain percentage to be low and very low, a certain percentage to be moderate, and a certain percentage to be above moderate. And they'll do it through an agreement with the city to say that they're going to keep those available at those rates for 30 years, 40 years, 55 years, something on those time range, really long time range. So that's how the city is able to monitor what units stay essentially deed restricted affordable through development agreements and through other affordable housing agreements.
Right, but how are you going to control the low-income housing? The builder comes in and wants to build low-income housing, and that's all you're getting. What are you going, I can't understand how you're going to grade the type of construction, the facade and everything else are going to come with the property, because construction is construction. Footing is the same, everything's the same, everything's the same. How are you going to make sure that it is affordable? I can understand you using the income levels and so on like that, but the cost of construction, a builder has to make a profit on it. So if the builder can't make a 25% profit on that development, what's going to encourage him to build it to your standards or your price range?
So that part of that is if you use certain things like state density bonus, you're required to set aside a certain number of units at a certain level. So you have to make those units affordable at that level to be able to qualify for, say, density bonus, which can get you a lowered parking standard. It can get incentives for developers to help offset some of the cost of a lower housing development. So you're right. It is, a developer does get less money when they have a low or very low or low unit, but they can help offset that by having additional units, through density bonus. They can offset it by funding sources the city helps to identify. So outside funding sources that the developer may be available, different bond programs, different funding agencies. You're right, it does take some sort of subsidy to come in and do that type of development. So that's basically up to each individual development that comes in, how they're going to structure that, how they're going to get these affordable units. So they do have to work with the city. It's not just a handover process and it's done. It is a collaboration with the city. It's a very iterative process. And there's a number of different ways it can occur. And it really is preference of the property owner, preference of the developer. But ultimately, they do get into agreement where it's required that these units be held at this level for a certain amount of time.
Now, this is supposed to encourage home ownership, am I correct?
Not necessarily. The units don't.
My point
Sorry.
is, if a developer comes in and he wants to build apartments, does that fall into question? And he wants to do low-income housing apartments. What percentage of those low-income housing buildings have to be fit that? I know you can get a mix in there. A certain percentage of that development has to be low, and then you can escalate them. And then what regulates the rents as being affordable? Is there a step that they can only take so often? What regulates the income level for the builder that makes rental housing?
It really depends. So the first one, the housing element doesn't consider any difference between rental or for sale. It treats it all the same in terms of the number of units. And then the second part, it really is up to that developer and up to the agreement that they set for how that's going to be determined. The housing element doesn't go into enough detail to determine and work out those agreements. It's a high-level policy document, and doesn't dig into how those individual agreements will work between a city and developer or whoever is going to be part of the agreement.
Okay, because I was just reading where the Inland Empire is cheaper to rent than own. So obviously you're going to build to the user. But in Orange County, it's the other way around. And with development coming to the Inland Empire because of the price of Orange County, it could flip around too. So affordable housing may be purchase housing versus rental housing. And will the government be subsidizing rental payments? I know they've done 235 I and Ds early on where they would subsidize the interest rate to get it down to be affordable. Is that programs that are going to be available? Well, the reason why I'm asking that is because your low-income housing can be a better grade of housing because the payment is subsidized. Is there anything in that?
Yeah, so all development is still required to go through the city's design review process. So the quality of development still has to go through the city. There are different processes that kind of dictate what that process is. But yeah, things like
government
Section
does
8,
subsidize those.
yeah, things like subsidized housing like Section 8, like home funds are still available. I know there's long lines to qualify for those, but those programs still exist. They're still out there to be able to help subsidize some of these housing developments or give people essentially the ability to afford some of these units. So those programs still exist. The city has it in their housing program to look at additional housing sources as they become available. The state's putting a lot of emphasis on lower income housing and more funding sources are coming out. But again, a lot of qualification for a lot of those depends on a certified housing element. So,
Okay, thank you.
yep.
Is this one on? Yeah, okay. So no questions, but a couple of comments. I just want to follow up on what Jerry just said, and that is that the low income and the low income are not marketable. And the reason they are is because of some of the issues he brought up. And they do depend on either financing subsidies or direct subsidies. And they just don't exist without it. So comment number one, this is your outreach. We have 4 members of the public here, 2 of which would have been here anyway, 1 of which I think lives here. I think part of that is the fact that the links on your website were not made active until sometime yesterday. I notified Angela Friday night that no one could get through. So I think this is pretty much not what it was supposed to be. There should have been, the information you provided is nothing new. It's just a rehash of what we've been through in the past, and the idea should be to reach more people, but we're not. So I think something is wrong with the outreach that's going on.
Thank you. We'll take a look.
Good evening, how are you? Not too bad. What brought me here tonight was, first of all, I found out that this gentleman was, I think, my hearing's not very well, but I think he was commenting about the relatively short notice of tonight's proceedings. We found out about it in the Chino Champion on Friday night or Saturday morning. And what struck us was, I'd be willing to bet that everybody in this room has seen pictures of the state of our reservoirs right now, not just in the state of California, but the entire western United States, and the fact that they are at historical low levels. In fact, I think Lake Mead is about where it was when the dam was built. And I didn't have a chance to go through the entire 100-plus pages of your plan. So I apologize for my lack of preparedness. But I was struck by the fact that your plan contemplates building approximately 7,000 new units in the city of Chino. And with one exception, I was not able to find any reference in this draft plan to where the water's coming from. And the one section that I found was it's on page 7 of section 4 of the plan, and it talks about housing goals. And housing goal number 3 incorporates housing policy 3.4, which reads, ensure new residential development is adequately served with infrastructure and public facilities such as schools, sewage treatment, domestic water, public parks, fire control, and police. So one question I have is what constitutes adequate water service? There is a publication that I believe, I'm not sure if I found it on the city's, no, it came from the watereducation.org that said that every residence takes about, somewhere between about 1 and 1.5 acre feet of water per year. 7,000 units, 7,000 plus acre feet of water per year. My question to you and to anybody else who's listening to these comments or evaluating them is, how can the city ensure that there's going to be adequate water supply to service 7,000 new units without reducing the existing water service to existing customers? There was an interesting op-ed piece, it was in the weekend paper. A woman wrote in to say, well, they told me that I had to cut back by 15%, so I did. So where's the next cutback going to take place? The existing municipal guidelines for the city already tell us that we're on restricted watering schedules. Frankly, I didn't know that until I looked it up. But right now, technically, we're only supposed to be watering every other day. Where is the water coming from?
So a few points, and I agree. I'll start off saying I agree with what you're saying. You'll probably hear if you listen to the previous workshops, the council, staff challenged the allocation of the number of units with the State Department of Housing and Community Development and with the Southern California Association of Governments. Many cities did, many on the basis that there wasn't adequate water supply. That was not deemed to be an appealable argument by the Southern California Association of Governments, by SCAG, so that was disregarded. So that's kind of high level. Document level, the city is required, once they adopt a housing element, to provide it to local sewer and water purveyors to make sure that they can try and adequately plan. In terms of actual development, every development that comes in has to do an individual analysis for water supply, just like they would typically through the city's process. So,
But that's after the fact. That is after this plan, presumably, is adopted, if in fact it is adopted. The plan says housing policy will ensure adequate water service. Number one, what is adequate water service? Quantify it. Can it be quantified? Has it been quantified? Number two, how can the city make the statement as part of this plan that we can ensure an adequate supply to 7,000 new units without impacting our existing population?
So the document that you have in front of you lays out the zoning that would allow development to happen.
No, this is the plan. This is
Correct.
page 4-7 out of your plan.
Correct. So the way the city ensures that is by going through the development process they have set in place, which requires water supply assessments to occur for developments to ensure that adequate water can supply. And again, I can't quantify adequate water like you're asking. It depends on the different developments, depends on what's required of that development. But the city's current process that requires developers to look at water service, water availability to their property to accommodate the residential, commercial, industrial, whatever the development may be, those developers still have to go through that same process. And if they can't determine that they are able to develop a housing or commercial or industrial or whatever it is that's going to get adequate water, they have to be able to mitigate that before they can get any development built. So all these existing city processes that look at water supply still exist. This is just the zoning identification for those housing units to be built. So there is additional discussion in ultimately the CEQA document that will come out for this, the California Environmental Quality Act environmental analysis document. But even then, it doesn't go to the level that looks at individual developments because this This is programmatic. This is not project specific. We don't have projects to evaluate yet.
But all of that is, again, I don't mean to be repetitive, unnecessarily repetitive, but it's all after the fact. It's all after this plan, assuming it passes muster, is adopted. So what the city is saying, we're going to adopt a plan that allows for 7,000 new residential units, and we have no idea in the world where this water's coming from. And I respectfully submit that that's kind of poor planning. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That was an excellent comment. The will serve that is done is not about the quantity of the water. It's about the quantity of the distribution facilities. The quantity of the water, as we know right now, there's an excellent article that just came out by one of our national hydrogeologists, came out yesterday, that addresses this. It's not that California's short of water, it's just that we're short of cheap water. And we're short of cheap water because it's diverted politically. So the local level doesn't determine the water ration. And if there is ever a true drought, the very first thing that you do in any drought is a moratorium on building. So this gentleman is absolutely correct. So what we are providing and what the city is guaranteeing is that there will be a pipe there, not that there will be water in the pipe.
Thank you.
Can I ask one question?
Of course.
I won't make any more comments, but you made a comment about there being a city council and planning commission meetings upcoming soon to discuss this plan. When are those?
So next Monday at 7 o'clock is the Planning Commission. I think it's July 19th. Is that the date? Yeah. And then
Is the planning commission?
Planning Commission,
Yeah.
7 p.m.
The
That's
item may not be heard that early, but the start of the meeting, 7 o'clock.
And the planning or the city council?
Tuesday,
Tuesday.
the day following. Yep.
the 20th.
And again, these are both regular agenda items, so they may not be heard until that point in the agenda.
I understand that we really are going to have to do this no matter what, because the state's saying so. What about the cities that have moratorium on apartments or condos? Like in San Pedro, where I grew up, they tore down all those lovely arts and crafts homes and built big old blocks of apartments. And they did at one time require parking. I understand now the state doesn't want parking, but people still are going to own cars no matter where they live. I have family in Chicago. They live in downtown Chicago, but they have cars because you still have to go and do things. And public transportation sucks, period. End of discussion. And especially now, since we've all gone through this COVID stuff and everybody's afraid to touch anything, who wants to get on a public bus or anything else? And as for the water, some very valid points. I mean, I've lived in Chino for 36 years. And I miss the dairies. I miss a lot of stuff that we don't have anymore. We still have the smells, but not everything else. So I'm not too excited over this, but I do understand that we really don't have a choice. We're being mandated to do this, and I think that this is part of what we need to understand when we vote for people. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. We appreciate it. Any other comments or anything else anyone would like to say? Okay. Well, thank you. We really appreciate your comments. We will look at the website to make sure that everything is active. And as we go forward, the city may consider additional outreach if that's something that's appropriate. Certainly City Council and Planning Commission coming up next week. So with that, we appreciate you taking the time to come out tonight. We'll stick around here for a little bit. If you have any questions you want to ask, I'm happy to stick around for a couple minutes and answer those. Otherwise, the city website has plenty of resources, including the survey, which I encourage you all to take and encourage your neighbors and friends and family to take as well. And with that, I appreciate it, and everybody have a great night.